Hey, this is Writers Row. I'm DC Wright-Hammer, and on this episode, we're going to talk how to write that book you've been talking about. And I brought on a very special guest to help. I'll let her introduce herself.
Hello, my name is Meg Trast, author of Write That Book You Keep Talking About, How to Stop Planning and Start Drafting.
There'll be a link in the description for that book, and I'll put the book cover somewhere in the video, wherever it fits. But I brought you on, Meg. Really appreciate you coming on. This episode is really geared towards those people who just want to get into writing. So, you know, they've heard about it. Maybe they have some ideas. They've maybe jotted some things down here or there. But the book you wrote is about writing the book for others. And so, you know, why don't you just give us a little background on that book? Tell us, you know, what inspired you to write it, and then tell us a little bit about it.
Absolutely. Write That Book You Keep Talking About is specifically geared toward people who have had some idea or experience in their life that they want to document in a storytelling type style. And the inspiration for that book actually came from Marvin Carolina Jr., who is the president of our local Better Business Bureau chapter.
Okay.
Also an expert entrepreneur, and you know, just he grew up in a difficult situation and made his way from that to a better life, and he really wanted to document that. And that was how we met, was that he wanted to write this book. And so we're going through the steps, and I'm explaining to him, you know, here's A, B, C, and D, here's your checklists. And he said, do you have some sort of guide for this? And I was like, well, no, it's just kind of like in my head, and I just share it with people. And he was like, well, Meg, why don't you write a book about writing a book? Like, what could make more sense than that? And thus, Write That Book You Keep Talking About was born, and we are here to get you started.
So, right. So if someone is like, man, it'd be really cool to write a book, where do they start? Like, what's the first step?
Well, if you've had that thought, there is already a really good chance that's the first step. Having an idea is step number one.
Okay.
The difficulty often arises in the fashion of, okay, I have this idea. What do I do with it? And a lot of people will just take that idea and start writing stuff down, which is fine. That's a good way to get started. But typically when you have a broad concept for a book, what you really need to do is take a few minutes and decide what specific aspects of that you would like to document. Decide what your end goal is with the book.
Right.
And then put together an outline.
So when you say end goal, I've covered a lot on this channel. Your definition of success, that's what I call it.
Ooh, I like that.
The definition of success for you. So basically, when you get to the end of this whole writing thing, define what looks like success for you. So is that sort of, you know, what you're talking about, what it looks like at the end?
That is pretty close. The question I typically ask newer authors, let's see how many spoonerisms I can fit in here today.
There you go.
Nice. The question I typically ask newer authors is, what do you want people to think about when they're done with your book? They get to the last page and they close it. What's the first thought you want to be on their mind?
Got it.
So in a sense, that would be, what is your definition of success? What would make you happy if readers came away from your book thinking blank? Would that be successful?
Yep. So they have this idea, they come up with their end game, like what they want to come out of writing this book. What's some of the filler in the middle that might get in the way from them from doing this and actually going from point A to point Z?
Sounds like you're talking about the mushy middle, which so many of us despise. Typically that arises from not having a full understanding of what you want your book to convey. And whether this is fiction or nonfiction, If you don't have clear goals in mind for what you want your audience to come away with, that's typically when you'll hit roadblocks or just stumble over knowing what to put onto the paper next. I like to think of fictional stories at least as having, roughly 3 acts. Act 1 is easy, and Act 3 is typically pretty easy. Act 2, that's where some of the difficulty comes in. Think about being in college and writing a thesis statement.
Mm-hmm.
And as you are beginning your outline, write a thesis statement for your book. Here is the information that I want to examine. Here are some opposing viewpoints. And here's the conclusion we're going to come to at the end of the book. And that's the start of your outline. I know thesis statements are everyone's least favorite thing.
Right.
Typically. But they help you create a structure, a sort of mesh frame around which to form the rest of your work.
Well, and you kind of summarized it as introduction, conflict, and resolution.
Exactly. Like, 3 acts.
3 acts. And that's true of fiction, obviously. We meet our characters, some things happen, the end helps us resolve some of that. But even in nonfiction, if you're selling people on ideas, if you're selling people on, if it's educational or if it's even biographical, like, you could just, this happened, then this happened, then this happened. That's fine. There's an audience for that to some extent. But oftentimes if it's storytelling, if you want to be compelling, you do want some of that drama, some of that conflict in the middle. And that can drive even nonfiction in a lot of ways.
Oh, absolutely. The book I wrote, Write That Book You Keep Talking About, starts with an idea. Mm-hmm. You want to write a book. Okay. Let's go over some of the technicalities of book writing. Make sure that you're versed in some of these basics. Let's move on to things you might want to do and things you might want to avoid and the opposing school of thought. And then end with a call to action. Hey, you've learned this stuff. Now go compile your notes and start your draft. 3 acts. Nonfiction, still 3 acts.
And how often do you see things? So we've heard writer's block. I've heard writer's block is totally a thing. I've heard writer's block is not a thing at all. It's completely made up. Again, the things that stop us, I think you mentioned earlier, it's usually a lack of planning more so than a lack of the ability to write. But, I guess, how do we stop, life from getting in the way of writing? How do we stop, psychological hurdles from getting in the way of writing?
Having a good plan is paramount. However, alongside that, I have come to learn over the years is having sufficient inspiration for your project. And I know that I talked about this years ago, but it still holds true. If you're writing a book, make sure that you're covering topics that you are incredibly passionate about, because that is what will really shine through in the end. Right. Things that you really care about, stories that you really want to tell, characters that you really want to bring to life, ideas that you think are important, calls to action that you think are important. Chris Tavener's book is a great example. Gaia Awakens. What are the primary ideas that you want to put at the forefront? And if you don't have a real clear sight on that, you're going to lose steam just because you don't really know where to go. Yep. So knowing what your ultimate point is really helps with writer's block, and having a drive to make sure that people really understand and absorb the impact of what you're trying to share also helps with writer's block.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you should have that plan. It should be your guide, but it should not be, in a lot of cases, at least for me, that the guide can't be my Bible, that it can't be the exact thing that I write. I write fiction. I'm currently writing fantasy, and I am actually at a stuck point, as I call it. Part of it is the story does not want to follow the plan. So I'm fighting story and plan. But I think the biggest problem I'm having is that I don't want to waste my writing time with something I'm not going to use, and that's something that I'm overcoming right now.
So let's I'm actually going to set up a really simple writing exercise for you. Whatever you want to physically happen at the end of the story, decide if your characters have the same goal. Now, if your characters have the goal of achieving whatever the final act is, throw as many obstacles in their way preventing them from doing that as you can. Make them work for it. Now, if your characters are just following a plan or the ending is going to be different than whatever they expect, then what you have to do is take your scenario, take your setting, and think, how can I drive these characters? How can I push them into doing what I want?
Right.
You have to sort of think like a malevolent deity sometimes, which is kind of messed up, but it really works for creating conflict and for getting through that mushy middle.
Yeah, well, and I take this, I am a scientist. Instead of a malevolent deity, like, I just want to, let me experiment. Let me take them here and see if it works. If it doesn't work, my hypothesis was disproven. So let me come up with a new hypothesis and test that. And I just really have to get over myself and be willing to write something to prove it wrong.
So instead of, oh, well, my hypothesis was disproven, okay, but in what scenario would it be correct?
Well, yeah, that's true too. Yeah, and that works well. That works well when you can manipulate, a storyline and make it work. The problem I have is I like darlings. I like to, kind of go off on tangents in some cases and have fun with it. And so I really have to control myself, and sometimes there's, I'll do an info dump where I just exposition for a whole page, and that's not as fun. But I'm getting better at identifying that, and I'm also getting better at saying, I can just write. I don't have to write perfect. I don't have to write the final draft the first time. And I think, as newer writers, just write. Just put words on paper, whatever it might be, and see where that takes you.
Absolutely.
That can lead to frustration too, but at least it's active frustration rather than passive frustration, and you should be able to work it out.
Exactly. And I would say too, in the beginning, when you're writing your first couple dozen pieces even, just write for fun. Just do something that's fun. Make the characters do what you want. Make your story turn out how you want. And bully about the rest.
In a recent episode, I said the reason why I started writing is a perceived lack of control in my personal life. So I created a world where I have control over everything. Complete control. So
very valid.
And on that note, appreciate you coming on and talking about it. Go ahead and pitch the book one more time, and I'll wrap it up.
Sounds good. Don't forget to check out Write That Book You Keep Talking About, How to Stop Planning and Start Drafting by Meg Trast. It is available on Amazon and at overhaulmynovel.com.
Links in the description. Appreciate everybody watching this. Thank you, Meg, for coming on. We'll have you back soon, and we'll catch everyone else next time. Take care.